Welcome to Rare But Real, where we discuss what it takes to be a woman of God in these challenging days. And now, please welcome your host, Audrey Brogy.
Hey there. As I am recording this podcast today, it is March the 18th. And thinking about this time of year always makes me think about my parents. Every year when I moved, especially after I became an adult and I moved into this season, I would think about them because they got married young. They got married on March the 22nd, and their whole marriage is funny. I mean, it's good and it's funny because to hear my mom tell the story of how they got married, and I don't know, it's just really sweet. Maybe I'll have time, I'll share that at some point. But they got married on March the 22nd, and then my mother's birthday is March the 31st, although, well, I'll share a little bit about that later, March the 31st. And then my dad's birthday is a week later on April 6th. And of course, he always had a good time talking about how she was the older woman. They were born the same year, but she was older. And so he enjoyed teasing her about that. But, if they were alive, they will have been married 74 years, or they would be married 74 years. And I know that they would actually still be married because of the kind of people they were, the kind of people that believed in till death do us part. And it doesn't mean that their life was always free from struggle or trials or very hard times, not just in terms of what life throws at you, but even in their marriage, they had struggles and all kinds of things. That, especially as they got older, they were honest about some of those things and in helping us as their children and struggling with some things themselves. But thinking about their marriage and the longevity of their marriage and what I witnessed growing up as a little girl and then as a teenager and then as a young adult, and then seeing their commitment not only to each other, but their commitment to their children and grandchildren, and I don't know. They've just been an inspiration. And so I want to kind of dedicate today's podcast to them. And of course, I wish they were alive to hear it, but, they're rejoicing with Jesus and they're seeing their Savior face to face, and all the people that they've loved who are there as well. And those of us who know the Lord, and we will join them one day because we know that it's appointed for man once to die, and all of us will. But I wanted to share this because I think it will be encouraging for you, no matter where you are in your lifespan, whether you are a teenager who hopes to be married one day, or whether you're a single woman who is wishing to be married, or maybe you've been given the gift of being single and you don't really have any desires to be married. But you certainly, because you're a believer, care about marriages. And so you might glean something that could help you as you are, around married people. And then maybe you're in a marriage that's tough right now and you're struggling and you're wondering, and maybe it will be encouraging to you. Or some of you may just think, I'm just in a really hard time in my marriage. Or others of you are doing just great, and it would be encouraging in that sense. But sometime after my father died, and he died in 2014, I taught my mother how to speak into her phone and tell her story. Now, it's kind of funny because, although my dad had a cell phone, he had kind of a, cell phones, he had that mindset. He didn't really like them, but he did, but he didn't. And, but my mom loved technology. She loved having an iPad. She loved having a laptop. She loved having a phone, and she even liked getting the latest and greatest phone. Even well into her 80s, she enjoyed that. But I did teach her how to speak into her phone, and because she always wanted to tell her story, but she didn't tell her whole story. But I did discover that she did do that. I found it on her phone in the last couple of years, and of her life, and I didn't know she had actually done it. But I want to read it to you, and then I'm going to share some other things about their life and their marriage. But this is what she wrote and what I discovered. My name is Frances McKay. I was born in my grandparents' home. Their names were Beatty and Ella Strickland. They were my mother's, Maud Hill, that was her mother's name, Maud Hill's parents. Back then, when couples got married, they had to live with their parents and would usually rotate living in their parents' homes. Mama had 3 sisters that were younger than she was, and the youngest 2 were not married. Their names were Ellery and Leola. I grew very close to them because they would take care of me when Mama was working in the field alongside my daddy. His name was Walter Hill. Babies were born at home. When the mother was in labor, someone would have to go to town and get the doctor to come and deliver the baby. We didn't have phones, lights, or bathrooms. We had an outhouse to go to in the daytime and a chamber to use at night and a lamp and kerosene to burn for light, and it was a dim one. I remember studying my lessons by the lamplight at the kitchen table. Back to my birth. I don't remember it, but I do remember what I was told. I was told I was born sometime in the middle of the night, and my birthday is written in the big family Bible. It's written April 1st, 1933. My daddy always loved to play practical jokes, and I got my share of it on my birthday because my birthday was April Fool's Day. At some point, we moved to Grandpa Strickland's house. Of course, hang on to that, because I know now I'm digressing from what she wrote, but hang on to that thought, because I know I told you in the beginning that their birthday's March 31st, but I'm going to explain that, or she will explain it in a little bit. At some point, we moved to Grandpa Strickland's house that he had moved out of when he bought another farm on Hill Road. I don't know the dates of the moves back and forth to parents' homes, but I was told by Mama when it was time to rotate to Daddy's parents' home, she told Daddy she was not going back unless she had her own kitchen and she could do her own cooking. She had taken over the cooking at her mama's house when she was 12. Mama was the 9th of 12 children, and she could see her mama was getting frail and she needed a lot of help. Daddy's parents agreed for one of their rooms to be converted to Mama's kitchen. My kitchen table is the one Daddy built for their kitchen that I always saw growing up as a table used to butcher hogs. All the cuts are still there. I said earlier we were living in Grandpa Strickland's house I was born in. The first memory I have was when I was 3 years old. I wrote a poem about my first memory, and I called it Memories in 2010. That's when she wrote the poem. Then when I was about 3 or 4 years old, we had a big snow, and Daddy made boots for me out of an inner tube for me to wear in the snow. The snow was so deep, he had to hold my hand and lift me up to help me take the next step. I have always remembered that day in the snow with Daddy. I started to school at age 5 and rode the school bus. The most arguments and fights I ever had was with the boys who would open the bus window and jeer at the children who were walking to school and we were riding. Children are the same no matter what generation, right? Anyway, she continues, we didn't have a lunchroom, so we had to take our lunch to school. And the first time I ever saw a soft drink bottle was when one of my classmates brought one to school and opened it to drink with her lunch. She offered to share with me. I found out that I didn't know how to drink out of a bottle. I kept sticking my tongue in it. I turned the bottle up to get the soft drink, and it never came out of the bottle, so I gave it back to her. And to this day, I don't like to drink out of a bottle. We finally got a lunchroom at the school when I was in the 4th grade. Mom and Daddy couldn't afford to buy my lunch at school, so whenever we had extra milk or eggs, Mama would let me take it to school so I could eat in the lunchroom that day. One day, I dropped the milk and broke the jar. Milk scattered all over the floor of the school bus. I cried, not because the jar broke, but because I wouldn't have anything to eat that day. After that, I took my lunch. We had a rolling store that came by every week or two, and Mama would give me eggs so I could trade them for whatever she needed. And I could get Mary Jane's, my favorite candy. What a treat that was. I had Mama and Daddy all by myself for 4 years and 1 month. And then my sister Frankie was born, and I was so happy. And then 2 years later, my sister Helen was born. It was very clear Daddy wanted a boy, and by that time I knew it very well. I knew when Mama stopped going to church or anywhere else that she was expecting another baby. Back then, Pregnancy was not talked about, and children were not supposed to know anything. I knew Mama was in labor when Daddy came to me about 3 p.m. one day and asked me, "Don't you want to go spend the night with your cousin?" I told him no, but he made me go anyway. I told my cousin, and we lay under the car to see when Daddy was on the way to get the doctor. It was almost dark, so I knew a baby would be born that night, and I sure hoped it would be a boy. Daddy came after me early the next morning. I had to go to school, and I was so happy to tell everybody that I had a baby brother. I don't remember saying to Mr. Ward, the school bus driver, what he told Daddy I said. He told Daddy that I said, Daddy was so happy that he ran out of the house and ran around in circles yelling, "It's a boy, it's a boy, it's a boy." Now, I was almost 10 when Willis was born, and then there were 3 more sisters born, all at home except the last one, and her name was Nelva. After Willis, Mabel Jane, Faye, and then Nelva. I always told my brother that he was the meat in the sandwich because there were 3 girls, then 1 boy, and then 3 more girls. Now, we had a great time working and growing up together. I remember a time when Mama went grocery shopping in the summer and left me in charge of Frankie, Helen, and Willis, who was 9 months old at the time. We were in the car parked right by the grocery store on the side that the street houses were on. It was hot, and Willis cried and cried. I started walking with him up and down the sidewalk by the car, and he wouldn't stop crying. So this lady came out of her house on the back porch where it was cool and invited all of us in and gave us water to drink. Willis didn't cry anymore, and she didn't call the police, and Mama came very soon. She thanked the lady, and then we went home. That's the way it was back in that day. People looked after each other whether they knew them or not. Going back to the time when we lived in Grandpa Strickland's house before living in the house that Daddy was building. At that time, it was just me and Mama, and we would walk about a mile to visit Mrs. Ward. She made the best biscuits, as good as my mama's, and I would ask for a biscuit as soon as I walked in the door, and she would give it to me. One day, Mama said, "Francis, you better not ask for a biscuit as soon as you walk in the door. I will spank you if you do." Well, I knew she meant it, so I didn't ask Mrs. Ward for a biscuit as soon as I walked in the door. Then Mama said, "Come on, Francis, we got to go home." That's when I asked for a biscuit. And you know, I didn't get a spanking that day. I guess it was Mama's fault, though, that I like biscuits because she has always told a story about me. She told me, "You slept on a cot by my bed because it was so cold until we built a fire in the wood stove when we got up. After you quit nursing, you would wake up in the middle of the night wanting something to eat. I would go to the kitchen and get you a biscuit. It didn't take me long to figure out that if I put the biscuit under my pillow when I went to bed, I could give it to you when you woke up in the middle of the night, and I wouldn't have to get up and get so cold." Now, another story about bread that Mama told me. At church, my Grandma Hill sat about 3 seats from the back, and Mama sat about 5 seats from the front of the church. That was in the day that all the men sat on the left side of the church and the women on the right side of the church. Mama said I was a little over 3 years old, and I wanted to sit with Grandma Hill, and so she let me one Sunday. She said, "That Sunday we had communion. The deacons were serving the bread and had passed my row when I heard your voice. I looked around and saw you running after the deacons yelling, 'Me want a piece of bread, me want a piece of bread.' As you were passing by my row, I reached out and grabbed you, and I pulled you into the seat by me. After that, I never let you sit with anyone but me." From the time I can remember, I wanted to be a nurse. The health department nurses brought immunizations to the school and gave the shots to us. After I got my shot, I would stand out of the way and watch others get theirs. I think that was the beginning of my wanting to be a nurse. I would ask for a doctor bag for Christmas every year for several years. I had so much fun giving out candy peels and doctoring whoever would let me. Gerald, who I would later marry, and I were in school together for 12 years. I do not remember him before the 3rd grade, but we were playing at recess, taking turns sliding down the slide. The first time I remember him, the kids started screaming, and I went to see what they were screaming about. Gerald had a big cut below his knee, and it was bleeding profusely. The teachers carried him in the school, and I followed them and watched them wrapping his leg to stop the bleeding. The same classroom that I had watched nurses give shots in. They carried him home, and his daddy wasn't home, and his mom had no way to take him to the doctor. So the teachers took him to get his wounds sewed up, and they brought him home. I guess that was the second thing that sealed my desire to be a nurse. I wanted to help him. Our school bus had 2 routes. I was on the first route and Gerald was on the second route. The teachers got to school when the second bus arrived. We had a heater in each classroom that burned coal, and I built the fire in the heater in the first grade room. Can you imagine? One of my classmates came in and tried to take over making the fire, and we got in a fight. I straddled her, and I held her hands back by her head. She couldn't do anything but spit, and boy, did she spit right in my face. We built the fire together after that. You know, I ran into her in a store 40 years later, and we laughed and talked about our childhood at Center Elementary School. I asked her if she remembered that incident, and she said, "Yes, and I forgive you." She forgave me long before that, though, because we were friends through high school and lost contact as we all went our separate ways after graduation. I was in the 4-H club in elementary school, and our leaders took us to Timrod Park in Florence for a picnic, and we all had to bring sandwiches to share at lunch. We never had light bread, so Mama cooked ham and biscuits, lined a shoebox with waxed paper, and filled it with ham biscuits. I didn't want anybody to see what I brought, so I slipped around and put my box on the table when no one was looking. I knew everybody else would have light bread with sandwiches, and I didn't want them to see what I brought. I felt proud, though, watching the shoebox and the teachers and their excitement over having ham biscuits and not eating light bread sandwiches. That's all she wrote, you know, and as I've read that, as I found it on her phone and read it, and then as I've read it to my grandchildren. I even printed it out and put it in a little book so they would have it, because it's just so sweet, and it's so great hearing about what her life was like in rural South Carolina as she was growing up. And some of the things are just so different now, and even her calling bread light bread, and what she meant by that was store-bought bread, you know, bread that you buy from the store, because, you know, my grandma always made biscuits, and that's how they had sandwiches, was from my grandma's biscuits. But my mom often told that story through the years about the ham biscuits because of how much the teachers liked them. And so many things stand out to me in that story, just the normal things that all children feel, no matter what age, no matter what time in history that they're born. You know, I mentioned about, you know, kids laughing at other children who had to walk. And then things about, you know, a soft drink bottle, and then what children feel like when another baby's coming, and all those things. And even the things that my grandma shared about little tricks of the trade that she learned taking care of her little girl Frances with getting hungry during the night. And then even the fight with my mom and her friend at school. But even thinking about how these little children, they're the ones who are lighting the fire in the wood stove. Just a different time. But the neatest thing about that story is hearing how she noticed my dad for the first time. And so years later, when I was visiting with my mom and dad, and it was the year before he died, but I would go and visit them, and sometimes I would be in his bedroom, and I would ask him lots of questions, you know, just to talk to him about how he came to know the Lord and about their early years of marriage. And so I came home after one of those visits, and this is what I wrote. There we were sitting in the room next to my 80-year-old daddy, and I asked him about the early years, not the early years in general, and not his childhood or teenage years. I asked him about his early married years, those years of his becoming a husband, becoming a dad, and what happened in his life for him to become so intentional about his faith. He began to tell me, and as he struggled with some of the minute details of dates and places, we called Mama into the room. Together, they told me their story. When Mama and Daddy first got married, she was in nursing school, and at that time, there was no housing for married women. Before her marriage, she lived in the dorm, but then had to find a different place to live. Now, I imagined my mom, the beauty that she was and still was as a young bride. I imagined her so in love with my daddy and he with her. It was the early 50s, and in fact, they got married in 1952. My dad's job was 2 hours away from the nursing school where she was a student, so together they found a bedroom bath rental in someone's home. They both, as they were telling their story to me, almost in unison said the address of the house. They looked at each other, and suddenly I knew they were whisked away to that time. If this were a movie, the color would fade to black and white. Nat King Cole's Unforgettable would play in the background, and images of a woman with a hat and bobbed hair alongside a young man with a white starched shirt and combed back wavy hair would appear. But in this moment in 2013, I saw the look of the eyes of two people still in love. And as they continued to tell the story, I felt like I was watching that movie. It was like they were alone, and I really shouldn't be there, but I was, and I was captivated. I was witnessing a steadfast, I choose love so strong. I was witnessing a chosen love, the kind of love that had stood the test of time, stood the test of many trials and tough times in their marriage, yet had embraced the joys and sorrows of nearly 64 years together. And this I choose love was still standing. Their new place was across the street from the hospital, right in town, within walking distance of everything she needed. This was important because my dad commuted to his job during the week and came home for the weekends. Later, they discovered they were going to be parents. My older brother was soon to be born, and they needed another place to live. After some searching, they found a rental house with 2 bedrooms. They talked about that little house. Then my dad looked at my mom with a slight smile. He said, "I can still see him climbing over the fence." Now, I'm listening to this and watching, and I was wondering, who did he see climbing over the fence? But my mom knew exactly. She said, "I can too." And it was then I knew they were seeing my older brother, their little blonde boy. And again, they looked at each other, and then my mom looked down. I don't know what she was thinking at that moment, but to them, I knew it was like yesterday, so clear, so vivid, and it was like I could see him too. I imagined a fence I had never seen, and a little tow-headed boy in suspenders trying to scale it. And why did I think he might have been a little tow-headed boy in suspenders? Because I had seen photos of what he looked like when he was a little boy. My dad continued, "He liked to play with the little boy who lived in the house behind us. Oh, and we were friendly with the family. They were a good family." My mom added, "Yes, we built the fence to keep the children safe, to keep them from wandering." And then she smiled a faraway, annoyed smile. "But somehow he managed to climb that fence. Our neighbors, though, we helped each other, and it was safe." It was during this time in their lives that, as a young couple, they traveled 10 or so miles to go to church where my mom grew up. As they talked, Daddy said, "We just went to preaching." I thought about this for a moment. I'd always known my parents to be at church for everything and to never be late for anything. My whole life was spent going to church, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and everything in between. But at that moment, my mom added, "And we were always late." It's funny, but you never think of your parents as being young ones. I mean, They're my parents. They've always been adults. They've always been there. They've always been there. They've always been responsible. They've always told me what to do and held me accountable. Well, one Sunday, when they were late as usual, they were sharing this with me. My mom was so frustrated, she blurted out, "I hate being late. Why do we always have to be late?" At that moment, they were coming up to a crossroads, and Daddy decided to turn right and go to a church that was closer to where they lived. They both recalled how when they got to this random church, a man greeted them. He helped them with the children, and that was just 2 at that time, took them to meet people, and everyone made them feel so welcomed. My mom then said, "It was like we were the most important people in the world." Mom and Daddy started going to this church every Sunday, and they not only went to, quote, just preaching, but they attended Bible classes and other church events. They got involved in the body life of that church. Mama looked at me, and then when I got pregnant with you, they gave me a baby shower. I had never had a baby shower. They showed so much love to me. Then, relatively quickly, when I was pregnant again, so quickly after having you, they gave me another shower, except this time it was for me. I received bath soaps and pretty things, and I was so overwhelmed. She continued, "We loved that church, and the people, they acted like it was an honor to take care of and teach y'all, our children." It was there in that church where my dad got serious about his faith. He told me how he had become a Christian when he was younger, but as he grew older, he became, in his own words, apathetic. But seeing Christ lived out in the people of this church made such an impact on him. Hearing the Bible taught at this church made an impact. And the older men, they took an interest in this young husband and father. My parents never forgot it. Then my dad got tired, and as he did, my mom moved from the chair to sit on the bed next to him, and she held his hand. He drifted off to sleep. I didn't hear any more of the story that day, but I saw, and I choose love. I witnessed it, and I don't regret one single minute. Y'all, I just reading this again just reminds me of how they stood by each other through all of those years. And like I said, their marriage wasn't perfect. And you know, my dad became a pastor. I can fill in the details. After that, my dad became a pastor, and he went to seminary, and he did that as he was juggling, you know, his now 4 children. And they had some times when my brother got hit by a car when he was 10 years old, and he was in the hospital for a number of days. They didn't know if he was going to live or if he was going to die, but he lived, and he made it through that. And God used that profoundly in my mother's life. And at another time, I could share that story, because she shared that as well, of how God really used it to even to show her that she needed to be by my dad's side and be even more his helper as he was in the ministry. Now, having said that, you know, it made me think of that. And the reason I'm sharing it, as I told you at the beginning of the podcast, is because I'm thinking about them a lot as I'm coming up on their anniversary and then their birthdays. And thinking about it even in the day and age in which we live, when so many marriages struggle so much, and we all struggle. You know, no marriage is perfect. No marriage, some marriages have more issues than other marriages, but nonetheless, God calls us to run the race, and God calls us to choose love. And that's one of the things that I did see my parents do, even through some of the things that they had to deal with through in their earthly life. And I also saw in the last couple of years of my dad's life how my mom really took care of him, because his health declined so much. And she is the one, all of that nursing, you know, when you heard her story of always wanting to take care of him way back when they were in the 3rd grade. And here she was in his last last couple of years of his life, and she was taking care of him then. So saying all of that makes me also want to just tell you some of the things that I really appreciate about them, because their marriage to me, was just so significant. I appreciated the fact that they were so intentional about their faith. I appreciate the fact that they made it very clear that I wasn't a Christian just because they were. Or, I never really heard them use the phrase, God has no grandchildren, but they certainly taught me that, because I knew that I must receive Christ myself, as they patiently and little by little shared the gospel with me. But it was God who really showed me that I was indeed a sinner. And he showed me that, and of course my parents were teaching that all the time, and I was hearing it in church that people are sinners. But it hit me so much that I personally, as a 6-year-old child, was a sinner when I stole my sister's doll, and you can hear about that on another podcast. I won't go into the details of that now, but I stole her doll, and then I lied about it. And God just, even at 6, I was so convicted of my sin. And then during that time frame, I just remember God dealing with me. And then I was at church. I happened to, was at church, and I heard my dad at the end of the service share the gospel once again and invite people to, if they've come to know the Lord, to make their decision public. And I had come to know the Lord in the quietness of my little 6-year-old heart. And I still remember walking down that aisle, and I'm so thankful. I'm thankful for altar calls. I know lots of times people don't do them anymore because they've been abused, and I understand that. But if you don't abuse it, and if you don't manipulate, and you don't do all those things, it's such a wonderful thing, because I remember that. I remember, going down, and my dad was there, and with his outstretched arms, and I told him that I'd received Christ, and that I was a sinner, and I wanted to be saved, and he made sure once again that I understood the gospel. And then I remember too the encouragement from the body of Christ in that small rural church of people being excited about my decision for the Lord. So I'm so thankful for that. And then of course it was my dad later on who baptized me in a sister church, because we didn't have a baptism in our church. But so I'm so grateful for that. And then I'm also grateful that as I was growing up, that I was in church. It was like the center of our world. Now, we were involved in lots of other things. My parents were involved in things in the community and all kinds of stuff. But it was, we were at church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. And we had hymn sings, and we had revivals, which I love too. I mean, I know sometimes people poo-poo revivals today, but I love those. They were some of the most significant times in my life, as you heard, the word preached several nights in a row. And it wasn't like the church was trying to create a revival. I mean, it was called a revival because you're setting aside special time to gather with God's people and hear the word. And God, I remember so many of those and how God worked in my life through them. So I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that, sometimes when I didn't want to go to church, we were made to go. And I'm grateful for the participation in, at the time it was called GAs, and then Girls in Action, and learning about missionaries and learning Bible stories and Bible verses and missionary stories. So grateful for all of that. And even to this day, I remember so many Bible verses that I learned as a child, mostly out of the King James Version. But it was just such a great foundation, such a wonderful foundation. And not only that, but because the church was the center of my life, I know so many hymns because of growing up in the church. And I know that's not true for everyone out there. And sometimes people can hear that and think, well, I didn't have that kind of background. That doesn't matter. Just be grateful that God saved you and that he saw you and he brought you. No matter what your story is like, God uses all of our stories, and there are things that happen to us us that that God uses for our good and His glory. And so I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for times my parents told me no and wouldn't let me do things that I absolutely wanted to do and thought I was mature enough to do. I'm grateful that they had rules. I'm grateful that my parents never drank a drop of alcohol. I'm grateful that they drilled it in our heads to stay away from it, that nothing good comes from it. And you will never be an alcoholic if you don't taste the first drop. They were teetotalers, and my grandparents were teetotalers. I remember, and I'm talking about the grandparents I knew because I didn't know my other grandparents. They died. My dad's dad died when I was like a baby, like an infant. And then my grandma on that side died when I think I was 2. Or I was 2. So I don't really remember her. I remember stories about them, but my grandparents that I did know, that I grew up with, they were teetotalers, and they were against alcohol in every way, shape, or form. And they even, had their family Bible with the pledges in the middle of it, which I really appreciate. I know a lot of people grow up and they don't appreciate things, about their parents or their grandparents, or they look down on it or think it's lesser or think it's, they just weren't very smart, especially in this day. And whether it's Big Eva or whether it's all these educated, quote unquote, I'll say quote unquote, because I believe in education. But I'm just saying that, thinking that they've grown past some of the things that those who walked before us took seriously. So I'm grateful for that. And anyway, I just know that if they were alive, I would be celebrating their 74th wedding anniversary, but I'm still celebrating it because, they're in glory, but I'm celebrating it because in their memory. So, there's things I know that you could take away from just the things I have shared today that I hope are encouraging to you. And I want to tell you that if you're married, choose love. Choose love, choose forgiveness, choose to walk according to what the scripture teaches and not by your feelings. And I know with some marriages out there, they're very hard. There may be infidelity. There may be, addiction problems. There may be alcohol, whatever it is. Seek good, godly, biblical counsel for those things and do your best to fight for your marriage. I know sometimes even in, when women, and because I talk to women, they fight like crazy for their marriage, but their husbands still divorce them. And you can't sometimes stop those things from happening, but you can do everything within your power to love Christ, to obey what you know, and then others of you, I know plenty of women who have fought for their marriages, and their marriages are intact, and they have walked that road of forgiveness, and they're just thriving and doing so well. So anyway, maybe I'll share some more of stories at a later time. If you've enjoyed this episode, I would love to hear from you. I know it's a little different from what I normally do, but I certainly wanted to share these things because it's on my heart. This episode will drop 2 days after their 74th wedding anniversary. And I just hope that you are blessed by hearing it. Anyway, as always, I've been encouraged to ask women to, if you enjoy the podcast, share it with people, write a review, subscribe to it so you can hear it. Father, I thank you for this time. I thank you for all the women who listen. And Father, we love you and trust you. In Jesus' name, amen.
If you enjoyed this episode of Rare But Real, be sure to subscribe so that you will be notified when a new episode is posted. Please consider taking a moment to leave a review as it helps others discover the podcast. Follow Audrey on Instagram and Facebook at Rare But Real and listen to all of her messages on the Search the Scriptures app.